I'm Jen Gray, I'm Artistic Director of Forward, and I'm going to very briefly, so as to not take up too much time, introduce tonight's speaker. So you're going to be hearing from Dr. Sumana Chattopadhyay, who is an Associate Professor of Digital Media and the Performing Arts at Marquette University in Milwaukee. She's going to be talking about the genre of horror noir and Black storytellers in film, and I think it will be pretty obvious how that relates to the play tonight. So please join me in welcoming our guest speaker.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a loud voice, so, but thank you very much for having me here today. This is a topic that is close to my heart, so I decided to title my lecture, Horror, Blackness, and the History of Horror Noir. And why it is close to my heart is because for the longest time that I can remember, I have been like a hardcore horror fan. And people never realize that when they see me first, but I love horror, and I also love, films and TV shows that are social commentary. So this is a way to bring my two loves together, And because I talk a lot, I did decide to have like some content to look at and read at, otherwise I would be here forever. You know how professors are. So I want to start out with this quote from, I don't know if you've seen it, there's a fascinating documentary called Horror Noire that is relatively recent. And one of the quotes that stands out from the promo of the documentary, the very beginning of it, is from Black author Tananarive Due, and she says, "We have always loved horror. It's just that horror, unfortunately, hasn't always loved us." So then others chime in. First, we weren't in it. We were played by white people. We went from maids to pimps and hoes. If there was somebody black, they would be the first to die. And then the documentary goes on to talk about the function that blacks serve in horror movies and how there have been shifts over time. We have shifted, they say, from the focal point of the fear to being heroes, as when we hear from Ben, the black guy in The Night of the Living Dead, when he says, "You could be the boss down there, I am the boss up here." That was a pivotal moment for a lot of black horror fans because that was new, The documentary also acknowledges that we need more black people to tell their own stories, since white Hollywood hasn't always been great at telling those stories. And so one of the speakers there says, if we can use what we have experienced, we can tell stories that people have never seen before. So before I start talking more about horror noir and black horror, I want to talk about the 5 key characteristics of horror. What is the horror genre and what it is characterized by? So horror disrupts the everyday world. One of my favorite horror filmmakers, Mike Flanagan, says, why do we have so many haunted houses? Because a house is supposed to be a place that is safe for us. But when you bring terror into the house, that's what shakes things up, So horror disrupts the everyday world. Second component, horror transgresses and violates boundaries. Third, it upsets the validity of rationality. You're forced to believe in things you don't normally believe in. It resists narrative closure, which is why oftentimes at the end of the horror movie, something bad happens. It works to evoke fear. And also, there is a lot of physical and emotional violence and pain that is a part of the genre. And that is what makes a horror film, that the violence is happening often for a reason and has deeper shades to it. So what is horror noir? Horror noir functions as a double entendre. It simultaneously hails the dark or the noir, because noir is basically a French word for black, while also offering a nod to horror's complex relationship with good and evil, right and wrong. And it's the same for other kinds of noir that you see on TV, but those shades of gray and dark and light are constantly there. So horror as a genre demands to be examined when difference demonizes characters and creates or resists notions of good and evil. Also, horror has a fantasy element associated with it, and it is through horror's intrinsic fantastical quality that it brings out, the imagination, innovation, and the provocation that creates this commentary on social topics like, for example, Black culture, and offers a critique of mainstream convention and representation in some ways. So now what constitutes a horror film is often something we grapple with, like what is a horror film? What is the most exciting aspect of a horror film? So with horror noir, there's a long history, and I'm going to go back to some points in time and talk about some of the contemporary stuff. But I'm going to start with this moment in 1976, because I'm pretty sure there are a lot of folks here who have watched The Exorcist, right? How many people have watched it? Okay. So we all know The Exorcist. I have watched it. I'm a big horror fan. But when The Exorcist became such a popular movie, James Baldwin shared a brief but biting response to the film in The Devil Finds Work, a book-length essay that he wrote about racism in American culture. So he said, though the film follows a bedeviled priest attempts to save a girl who has been possessed by Satan himself, and that has become emblematic of a style of outlandish horror, with scenes like the one when the girl's head turns 360 degrees around, her neck. But Baldwin felt that it was horrific for another reason, and that was that white Americans would watch it and feel terror, and yet they would not experience any real fear when they were imagining the daily horrors of life as a Black American. So what Baldwin said at that moment was, the mindless and hysterical banality of evil presented in The Exorcist is the most terrifying thing about the film. He wrote, the Americans should know more about evil than that. If they pretend otherwise, they're lying, and any Black man can call them on this lie. He who has been treated as the devil recognizes the devil when they meet. That's what James Baldwin wrote about The Exorcist. Around the time of the release of The Exorcist, a genre of Black horror was already emerging in America, and it was typified by what we call the Blaxploitation films like Blackula and Blackenstein. Some of you might have seen those, in which Black figures embodied the monstrous creations of white writers. Despite the problematic aspects of the Blaxploitation era, which I'm going to talk about briefly next, these horror films with their Black-centric narratives actually did manage to mount a challenge to the other phobic assumptions that the horror genre had. So the Blaxploitation movement, which emerged in the 1970s, had excited many Blacks because they saw Blacks as central characters in a lot of these films. But also it generated a backlash among some Blacks who felt that the films portrayed African Americans in a bad light and encouraged negative stereotypes, and also that when they were trying to bring in the Black narrative, gender was suffering. The women were portrayed in a very negative light in those films. So many of the Blaxploitation film protesters felt the films only took place in the inner city, focused on drug dealers, pimps, and hitmen, and also they hated the language used in the films. But moving forward, what we think of horror noir and Black horror right now, and what researchers talk about this is, horror noir is both about Blacks in horror films as well as Black horror films. So Blacks in horror films present Blacks and Blackness in the context of horror, even if the horror film is not wholly focused on, the Black culture. Also, films have been historically produced by non-Black filmmakers, a lot of them, for mainstream consumption. So examining Blacks in these horror films offers insights into how Blackness is represented at the societal level by the majority, maybe in the society. Films like King Kong, for example, and The Serpent and the Rainbow, and then Candyman have had a tendency to code the monster as a racial creature. And going back further, one can't help but cringe when thinking of The Birth of a Nation, an iconic movie which casts Blacks as monstrous, savage boogeymen with troublesome cultural practices. While films like Candyman offer a stark commentary on race, there are also other kinds of horror movies like Halloween and Nightmare on the Elm Street, which I actually love. But here, the white monsters like Michael Myers and Freddy Krueger terrorize worlds where there are virtually no Black people, creating a kind of whitewashed world. But when it comes to Black horror films, like all other horror films, are informed by the same indicators of the genre, like disruption, monstrosities, and fear. However, these are also race films, just like you will see with Feeding Beatrice tonight, which is, I would say, a play that is similar to a race film. That is, these films have an identity and they shed light on racial identity and blackness. They're a mix of black culture, history, ideologies, experiences, politics, language, humor, aesthetic, style, music. And these films also often have a black producer, a director, writer, black actors. These films speak to black audiences or to white audiences who possess a curiosity or sensibility about racial matters that matters to them, the allies, you know. So together, blacks in horror films and black horror films offer a great opportunity to document how race and racial identities and race relationships are constructed and depicted in the media, because that also shapes how people think about these issues. And the horror genre has always been an advocate of social issues, you know, like talking about social issues, but now more than ever, this genre and black horror is proving useful to addressing dilemmas of difference or otherness, people that are different from us. How are they portrayed? The black experience, despite societal changes over time, continues to be conceptualized by a sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's own soul by the tape or measure of a world that looks on with amusement, contempt, or pity. So horror noir, as a genre, helps us understand how a society shaped by white influence can color people's perceptions and how blacks can take back their identity by reclaiming their representation in media. So I'm going to start with this movie that a lot of you have watched. So how many people watched Get Out? Okay. So, and Get Out will come up a few times during the lecture, but I'm going to start out with the scene in Get Out when the police arrive early and stop Chris Washington and his girlfriend Rose on the way to meet her parents. And the audience is already uneasy when this happens, because in many horror movies though, when the police shows up, that symbolizes the arrival of a trusted authority figure at a scene of a crime, where the audience can now breathe easy that, okay, somebody has arrived. But then, in this film, by the end of the film, after Washington strangles Rose, the flashing lights of the police car seem to signify danger rather than safety, evoking the many experiences of black men getting shot to death by cops and the history of white women falsely accusing black men of violence. So, which is a part of also, you know, but this is not new to our like entertainment, books, movies, films, because it's a part of African American horror tradition. So this tradition has a rich and roiling history beyond the silver screen. It can describe the fantastical or fantastic Gothic shadow art of Kara Walker, if you haven't checked it out, the dark-skinned vampires in the novels of Octavia E. Butler and Joel Gomez, the mythic and monstrous beings from the Caribbean and Africa in Nalo Hopkinson's fiction, and the haunting face in Betty Sar's artwork called Black Girl's Window, among others. Yet what does feel new in this black horror period of time is how visible these phantoms, real or imagined, have become for a nation of people who see them and the all true horrors that have sprung. From the transatlantic slave trade to the Tulsa massacre to the senseless killing of George Floyd, as if for the first time. The white Americans that Baldwin described may finally be paying attention to black horror and horror noir, at least on the surface. Yet to truly understand it in art or life means reflecting on the deeper and labyrinthine histories that brought us these ghosts in the first place, because it's all, you know, embedded in the history. And what a better genre than horror to, you know, talk about this, because horror is a safe way to experience our deepest fears without actually having to confront them. No matter how real something may seem, even if it is based on a true story, the genre feels appealing to us simply because it isn't happening to us. We have the luxury of turning away, of closing our eyes. But when its very identity as a Black American is the jumping off point for such stories, it becomes very impossible to distance oneself from torture and the trauma that well up when we see the flashing police sirens at the end of Get Out, when Chris Washington thinks he's escaped the clutches of his white girlfriend's sadistic family. Also, a demonic girl might seem frightening to everyone, but the fear of being followed or haunted by men in Klan hoods or blue uniforms is one that many white Americans, or even I for that matter, would never know. The resurgence of Black horror then forces viewers to witness the frightening reality of being Black in a world that still, as Toni Morrison would mention, associates the darkness of skin with the old meanings of darkness that our ancestors applied to the night. Things like fear, uncertainty, danger. So, however, this is all complex, and the genre realizes the complexities of these issues. The genre has a fine line to walk because when you're capitalizing on people's suffering, it could easily become perceived as a misery tourism, as was clear from the criticism of the TV anthology series Them. I don't know if anybody has seen Them. It was difficult to watch. Them is a show set in the 1950s featuring a Black family that moved from North Carolina to California in search of a better life and settled into an all-white neighborhood where within 10 days their lives were turned upside down by paranormal forces within the new home they lived in, as well as the overt racism of their white neighbors. At times, it became unclear which was more horrific or terrorizing, the supernatural forces or the evil white neighbors. However, believe it or not, Them got the most criticism from Black Twitter. Black Twitter said of Them, "These directors, writers, and producers love shopping around Black trauma for reactions and sales. Just one light-hearted movie would do, but no, we are expected to sit through this. This is trauma porn and adds a sense of dramatization or fiction to events Black people actually experience." So other movies like Candyman have offered an astute social commentary on race and racial inequalities. If you watch Candyman, it was about, Chicago's doomed Cabrini Green social housing project. But Candyman and other movies or TV shows that have walked that fine line were able to offer the audience some room to breathe and not be overwhelmed by the trauma or pain in the film. And because when you're looking at these movies and you're looking at the monster is oftentimes has racial undertones in a lot of movies. Like Candyman turned that embodiment of fear-mongering that exists in society in relation to race into a literal boogeyman that appears out of nowhere to violently murder people. The movie offers a perspective on the harsh reality that results when stereotypes applied to Black people are believed en masse. The new take on Candyman that came out recently tried to add layers to the social commentary because the original Candyman came out in 1992. The new one came out last year. It tried to bring in themes of police brutality and current other issues that impact Black communities. And the protagonist in this case was a Black man, whereas in the original it was a white woman. And it tried to do many things, but it didn't. But it tried to do too many things is what turned out in that case. But with Get Out and Us, Jordan Peele, the master of Black horror, achieved what no filmmaker has managed to do so far, to present Black horror as a commercial and a critical success with an appeal to a broader audience. And that was a turning point for Black horror. Get Out was a huge, unprecedented success, making $255.4 million against a modest $4.5 million budget. The film quickly became a cultural phenomenon, with stills from the film becoming memes and the phrase sunken place being permanently added to the American pop culture lexicon. The following year, Get Out was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Screenplay. It ended up winning the Best Screenplay award. And in Get Out, however, Get Out was not an easy story to tell, because in Get Out, Peele took a simple narrative of a Black man going to meet his white girlfriend's parents and used it to reckon with over a century of racial stereotyping of Black men. Every flavor of racism was on display, from the subtle liberal microaggressions to the more overt violent bigotry. It's a terrifying story exploring the ways white people have historically ignored the humanity of Black people, a simple truth taken to the logical extreme. However, Get Out had humor, Get Out had relatable characters, and Get Out somehow managed to walk that fine line we need to walk when we are talking about these stories. And as a Black filmmaker whose work directly interrogates race, in the wake of what was then the Oscars So White campaign, Peele was actually welcomed among the ranks of Hollywood's new black elite, with the likes of Ava DuVernay, Barry Jenkins, Ryan Coogler. For the first time in decades, there was a spotlight on black creatives in Hollywood, developing stories for both the large and the small screen that centered on representation and the nature of black identity. But Peele's arrival onto the scene marked a turning point for black horror, especially which had actually been sort of on the wane a few years before that, maybe a decade, and Get Out somehow changed that scene. Get Out took hold of the zeitgeist, ushering a new era of black horror from a crop of young directors, both black and white. Then Jordan Peele, went on to make Us, which some of you might have seen. Us was a story about the fear of the outsider. Peele said of this movie is about this country. We are in a time where we fear the other, whether it's the mysterious invader that we think is going to come and kill us and take our jobs, or the faction that we don't live near who voted a different way than us. We are all about pointing the finger. And Peele said, I wanted to suggest that maybe the monster we really need to look at has our face. Maybe the evil, it's us. That's what this movie was about. It was very successful in the box office. Another example of, black horror meeting commercial as well as critical success. Now, what does the story of films like Us and Get Out bring for us? It brings fresh energy to black horror. And it is what led to like high quality TV shows or anthology series like Lovecraft Country. If you have HBO, you must have watched Lovecraft Country. And of Lovecraft Country, I'm going to share these words from the final episode of Lovecraft Country, which wrapped up, at the end of 10 episodes. Here's what I'm going to share from that particular episode. Magic is ours now. A statement of reclamation. A revelation of what was lost is now found. An espousal of hope onto the present and future of black existence in an anti-black world. These were Letty's concluding words from the final episode of Lovecraft Country. For 10 weeks, people gathered around their small screens to be immersed into Lovecraft Country's world of Ardham and the equally epic reimagination of its US-based multiverse, Chicago, Kentucky, and Tulsa. To embark on a once-in-a-lifetime quest for reclamation of history, of futures, and of self. But such a journey did not come without a cost. Every episode bore with it disturbing images that haunted good sleep, traumatic racial histories that agitated wounds, and the stereotypical ghosts, shoggoths, and kumihos, so lots of different supernatural creatures. It was a great show, so watch it if you haven't. Now, examining all these films and movies, looking at them, leads us to the point when we can think about how, when we tell these stories, there's a lot of responsibility that comes with these stories of black horror, because they bring in a lot of people's trauma. And so we need to remember that when we're forcing a lot of folks to relive this trauma, whether personal or ancestral, for the sake of entertainment, we need to do it with a lot of responsibility and grace. But if it is done right, black horror can capture the all too real fear of walking through America in a black body and with ghosts and clones and body swapping conspiracies. It becomes an intentionally exaggerated and baroque realism, and horror noir becomes the kind of societal force that could hold a mirror up to society, but at the same time, it could offer audiences an artistic escape into the world of film or TV. So I hope, I wanted to go through a little bit of a history of the genre, and I hope you enjoyed my talk. I kind of have wrapped up, which I never do on time, so I'm glad. But if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. Thank you very much.